This morning I had a lesson plan talking about the unnoticed danger of life, and that is the sin of omission. We sometimes talk about sins of commission, which means we commit sin, and we sometimes speak of sins of omission, which means there are things that we should do that we don't. And it's much easier to just not notice the things we don't do than it is the things that we do. The things we do are kind of there. And things we don't do, it's almost like the saying that we sometimes have, out of sight, out of mind, that we don't think much about it because it's not something that's a real act to observe. It's just an act that doesn't occur. And sometimes that's something that's difficult for us to deal with. If you ask the question what you mean by that, let's look at a little definition. You know, sometimes we think of sin being something that we do that's wrong. And maybe the reason for that is that we have passages that are actually, in fact, we sometimes call them catalogs of sin, that they actually enumerate certain classes of sin. Galatians 5 is a famous passage. The works of the flesh are manifest, which are these. How many sermons have you heard on these subjects? How many times have you heard a series that takes the works of the flesh and divides them up? I've preached several of them and looks at each of them individually. And you look at what he says, the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenings, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I've told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. And that's what we usually think of when we think about sin. There's another list of sins that are enumerated in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Or chapter 6, rather. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 9. Know ye not, Paul said to these people, that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, or extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. Now you look at that, and again, what you see is a list of things that you're doing, and they're pretty apparent. You know, if you go down the street and you see something going on that's really wrong, you pay attention to it. But when you ride down the street and you probably don't pay much attention to the things that have not happened that should have happened. You don't think about those. They really don't occur to you much. Things that happen that are really bad, you see. Things that just never did happen at all, you really don't. And we have a tendency, therefore, to just kind of ignore that and not realize that is really a serious problem. I want you to go back with me a moment to the book of Matthew chapter 25. And this is a pretty lengthy reading, but I want to read it because I think it's important. Jesus is describing the judgment scene. And when he's describing this judgment scene, and he talks about the division of the sheep from the goats, those on the left hand and those on the right, those who would be saved and those who would not, he does not mention an overt sin at all. He doesn't mention the works of the flesh. He doesn't mention the things that 1 Corinthians chapter 6 mentions. What he talks about is things that are not done. That's what he talks about. And in this case, he's not talking about things that we would even consider just huge things. That's not what he's talking about. And so let's read it a little and notice it. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate one from another, as a shepherd divideth the sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was an hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not, and you took me in. naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. Then shall he say to them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was an hungered, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in. Naked, and you clothed me not. Sick and in prison, and you visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, or athirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to thee? And then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. And these shall go away in everlasting punishment, but the righteous to life eternal. You ever think about that? We generally think of the judgment scene, and we're going to see folks that are drunkards and people that are homosexuals, or people that are immoral and living an immoral lifestyle. That's generally what we think about, is those who will be on the left hand. But that's not what Jesus said at all. I wonder why that he would say that. You ever stop to think about that? I can't read the mind of God any more than I can read the mind of man. But one thing I do think about is this. When you're talking to your kids, things that are glaring, do you talk about them much? Probably not. Things that are not. Things that are maybe a little more subtle, you might pay more attention to them. For example, if you're walking along and you're up at Gatlinburg and you're one of these big overhangs and you're walking out and you're going to fall 5,000 feet if you fall off of it, not much of a reminder. But then if you come across a curb, they paint a little strip yellow. Why? Because it's not as noticeable. 7.5 inches is not quite as noticeable as 5,000 feet. So you kind of assume that people know you don't step off of a 5,000 foot cliff. But on the other hand, something that's a little more subtle danger, you pay more attention to. I wonder in my mind if that's what Jesus is saying. If he doesn't realize that most people kind of know that fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, and drunkenness, those are bad things. But then just not doing the common things of life that we ought to be doing as a Christian, maybe we don't think as much about. And there are reasons why we might not, which we'll get into in just a moment. But I want to think about this with you. If you went back, and sometimes you think about this last part, and I'm not going to read all these verses. I know that's a long reading beginning in verse 1 through 30. But if you look back and you think about it, this picture of the judgment scene, and all it talks about is the things that we do not do that we should do. That's all he's talking about. It doesn't talk about anything other than that. What led up to that? You know, if you think about building a house, what's the first thing you do? You build a foundation. If you ever notice, if you've ever been to a courtroom and you observe an attorney, it's pretty boring. But before he actually begins presenting the case itself, he usually kind of builds a foundation for that. Kind of gets the stage set so when he comes forward with it, you kind of understand what he's saying. Don't you think that's exactly what Jesus did here? Just think about the first parable that he gives in this chapter. The parable of the 10 virgins. What was the problem? There were no adulterers, fornicators, homosexuals among them, as far as I know. He didn't mention it. All he's talking about is they were standing here waiting for the bridegroom to come. They were expected to be ready when he came. And in order to be ready when he came, they had to have lamps that were lit. And 5 of them just brought a lamp but didn't bring any extra oil. And 5 of them brought extra oil. What do you think the lesson was? Do you think that doesn't relate to what he's talking about in verse 31? Isn't he laying a foundation of saying, yeah, there are things that are dangerous to you, but you may not perceive them. They don't really seem like a great danger at the time. I mean, you stop and you think about that and you understand that He is establishing a foundation. Well, what's the second commandment? What's the second parable that He has? It's the parable of the talents. Well, what's it all about? Does have any mention there of immoral people and drunkards and all that? Is that mentioned? No, that's not mentioned. As far as I know, all these were faithful servants, and when the Lord went into far country and He gave them things to manage for Him, when He came back, two of them had done a pretty good job, and one of them didn't do anything, and he just didn't do anything. And he went and hid the talent in the ground, went and dug it up when his Lord came back. So isn't He trying to establish a basis for the judgment scene? I mean, if you're writing a letter to someone about something, usually you kind of inform them about everything, kind of get them up to speed. In fact, we use that language sometimes. We say, well, I kind of want to get you up to speed so that we'll know what we're talking about. Well, that's what Jesus did. He got you up to speed. Because most people, most of us, usually, when we look at things that people are doing that are hideously wrong, we think of them. But when we look at things in our own life that we just don't do that we ought to be doing, we don't pay much attention to them. They don't really stick out much because they're kind of out of sight and out of mind. I wonder if that's what Jesus was doing. It's really interesting. You have an entire chapter, three parables really, including the judgment scene parable. You got three parables, and in none of them is an overt act of sin ever mentioned, and yet you're discussing people being lost. Now you think about it. What do you think that suggests to you? Now think about this. You look at all that being in the same chapter, and think about what James said in James chapter 4 and verse 17. James made a statement that you've probably heard so many times. And the statement is very clear. To him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it's sin. Now that's interesting. We think of sin being all these things that are mentioned in Galatians 5 and 1 Corinthians 6. That's what we think of sin. But that's not what he said here. In fact, in this case, he's really talking about people who take too much upon themselves. And maybe, to a certain degree, he's trying to set forth the same idea, that there are things that are wrong that we don't really think about being wrong. Just Luke 12. You think of the guy who was the farmer. And the sin he had was he didn't make any provision and had no thought for eternity. Everything he did was related to this world. Didn't think a thing about eternity. That's the sin of omission. I guess he was a faithful Jew. I mean, it's written in the book of Luke and probably was talking about a faithful Jewish man. But the fact of the matter is that there was something missing from his life. And he needed to recognize that. And he needed to do better. Now, when you begin to think about it, if we develop a thou shalt not type of religion, we're in danger. In other words, if all we think about, because we become kind of like the Pharisee, really, in Luke 18. I mean, you think in your mind, he said, basically the Pharisee said, I'm glad I'm not like other men. I sometimes do that, don't you? When I look at people who've just completely destroyed their lives with sin, I said, man, I'm glad I'm not like that. Well, that's good. That's good. I'm not like that. That's fine. But the problem is, am I suggesting by that idea that I'm glad I'm not like that because I'm the kind of guy I ought to be? And everything about my life is all right. And I don't have anything to fix. You know, if you stop and you think about the idea of being filled with the Spirit, Ephesians 5 talks about being filled with the Spirit. And it's interesting to notice the way that's expressed there. Sometimes we think about it, we don't really pay attention to everything that's written about it. But let's go back up to verse 15 of this particular chapter. Let's begin reading there. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. You know what that means? That means that you're noticing detail. Circumspectly. You're looking all about you and you're taking an interest in it. If you've ever been to a safety course, if you've ever seen a safety course instructor interviewed on television telling you what you can do to kind of improve your, lower the risk of your being attacked or assaulted or robbed or anything like that. Do you ever think about the first thing every one of them ever says? Think about this. You ever listen to a safety instructor, what will he tell you? First thing he tells you, be aware of your surroundings. Isn't that true? That's what he says. This walk circumspectly means you need to be aware of your surroundings. You need to pay some attention. Things that may not have much of, you may not think much of, may be the most important clue you're going to get. And he said, walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. Foolish people don't pay attention. Foolish people are kind of out of sight, out of mind. If it's not a problem, I don't care about it. He said, redeeming the time for the days of evil. Wherefore, be not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. Well, how do you do that? Well, don't be drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. Now you think about that. Be filled with the Spirit. Question. If a state trooper in the state of Tennessee decides that you might be impaired, driving under the influence, what does he do? Gives you a little bit of a test. That test, you look at it. You ever paid attention to it on TV? Put his finger up in front of you until you follow it with your eyes. And then he'll tell you to take your finger and put it on the tip of your nose, and you think, how silly is that? But you know what he's doing? He's reading a book. He's looking at the evidence. He's paying attention to what's there. So if I were to ask you the question, how would you know that your life is filled with the Spirit? How would you know? You can't see the Spirit. I mean, Jesus makes that statement in John 3. The Spirit's like a wind. You can't see it. But he also says in John 3 that while you can't see wind, when we had the tornadoes in Kentucky recently, I'm telling you what, you could see the effects of them without any problem. So you knew it was there, whether you saw it or whether you didn't. Well, in Galatians 5, sometimes we read this passage and we think about the works of the flesh. What we don't think about is there's a contrast to that. If you're filled with the Spirit, what's going to happen? Well, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. Now think about those words. They that are Christ have crucified the flesh with the affections and lust. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. But think about it. Just look at those things that he describes. Now those are things that are motivating factors. He doesn't talk about all the things it might cause you to do. Doesn't talk about the things that are addressed in Matthew 25, giving a cup of cold water or whatever, or clothing someone or taking care of them when they're sick. He doesn't talk about any of that. But you know and I know that when you talk about these things, love being the beginning thing, that you're talking about being careful not to omit things that need to be done to demonstrate that love. Now, how good are we at it? Probably, I don't know how you rate yourself, but I don't rate myself very high. I think I have a problem with it. I would think most of us would probably admit that. I don't believe I could get anybody here to say that I've never thought of something I should do that I did, nothing did I ever leave undone. I don't know if I'll ever find anybody to try to tell me that. Maybe you do better than some, hopefully. But we need to pay attention to it and to realize how important it is. There are things we need to be doing as Christians, and sometimes we just don't. I don't know how to put it in any language that's kinder than that. If we're filled with the Spirit, let's make sure that that Spirit motivates us to do the things that we ought in our lives. There's a statement in the Old Testament that you probably have heard before. it actually is in kind of an odd context, and it really doesn't really spring from something that's what it's often used for. But it is an interesting statement, and it does demonstrate that point if you pay attention to what he's talking about. There was a prisoner that was allowed to escape by the king, and he didn't keep God's command in regard to him. And so there's a prophet that wanted to make him aware of how serious an infraction that omission was. So the prophet departed and waited for the king by the way. The king was Ahab. He disguised himself with ashes upon his face, and the king passed by, and he cried unto the king and said, now this is the prophet speaking to the king, and he says, thy servant went out in the midst of the battle, and behold, a man was turned aside, and brought a man unto me, and said, keep this man. If by any means he is missing, then shall thy life be for his life, or else thou shalt pay a talent of silver. And then the servant said something that is so characteristic of man. As thy servant was busy here and there, he was gone. Of course, this is a fictitious case, said to make the king see the mistake that he had made. But I think about what he said and how true that is. As he was busy here and there, he was gone. In today's world, the parents of Jesus would probably have been charged with child neglect in Luke 2, because Jesus, they traveled a day's time and didn't notice he wasn't there. They was busy here and there, and they didn't notice it. Well, in this case, it really wasn't a big deal, and he was traveling with the family. They just kind of assumed he was with someone else. But you stop and think about situations that you see in court today where people are charged with child neglect because they're busy here and there, and they don't pay attention, and their child ends up in some serious problem. And you think of that expression and that excuse that's offered, busy here and there. What's the most commonly used expression in the English language? I'm not sure. But I tell you one that have to be at the top of the list when I have time. It would have to be one of the absolute most used expressions in the English language, when I have time. And you stop and you think, what's that saying? That's saying I'm busy here and there and I don't really have time. Why? What's taking the place of it? I mean, anything that you're not doing that you ought to be doing, what's taking the place of it? Something is. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you say I don't have time, realize that everybody here has the same amount of time. You have 24 hours in the day. So you have the same amount of time I have the same amount of time that you have. And we ought to think about it. When we start excusing ourselves for sins of omission, just not doing things that we ought to be doing, then what we need to realize is we're really saying I'm busy here and there, and there's something else that I think is more important than what I should have been doing. Now, we don't like it to be that blunt with ourselves, but that's the truth. We're saying there's something more important than what I left undone. Because after all, why do you do some things you don't others? Get up in the morning at our house, and Pat needs to vacuum. We need to empty the garbage, which is the biggest problem. Well, generally the garbage has got to go, because it's gotten to the point where you might vacuum the floor later and get a little bit dirtier, but the garbage is not going to get any fuller because there's no any place to go. So you recognize that. When you think about it, this idea that I'm busy here and there is something that we need to be very careful as to how we use. And to say I don't have time, that's a statement that we need to think about a great deal. In John 6, in verse 27, Jesus said, labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give you. For him hath God the Father sealed. You know, in other words, there are things that are important. There are things that are more important. When Jesus was tempted of Satan, we talked about this a little last week. What did he say? Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. So you have to think about it in connection with this. When you're thinking about what's being done and what's not being done and why, it's something you need to think about. It means you're putting priority on something that should not be prioritized. And something that should be prioritized is not being. And that's what this passage has said. Labor not for the meat which perisheth. Understand what's important and what's not. You know, the time to do what we know should be done is now. Life is a short window of opportunity. It's not a long window. It's a short window. I'm amazed sometimes at how we use passages for many years in a certain way, and we become so accustomed to it that we think that's exactly what it's saying when it may not be. Let me ask you something. When you have heard this statement made, for he saith, I have heard thee in a time accepted, and in the day of salvation have I succored thee. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. How many times have you heard that passage in connection with the invitation to be baptized into Christ? Probably hundreds. To whom was this statement made? You ever think about that? To whom was this statement made? Now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Let's go back up to verse 1. Paul is writing to the Christians at Corinth and said, We then, as workers together with him, beseech you also that ye receive not the grace of God in vain. He's talking to Christians. He's not talking to non-Christians. Now, I'm not arguing that doesn't have an application to non-Christians. But be careful that you don't think that Paul is trying to get folks outside of Christ to obey the gospel and he preaches this lesson. That's not what he was doing. He was talking to Christians who were just like him, had received the grace of God, and he said, be careful that you don't receive the grace of God in vain. Now is the day of salvation. In other words, today you have opportunity. And how long will you have opportunity? I don't know. I don't have any idea how long the opportunity will last. But I do know this. Jesus in John chapter 9 and verse 4 said this, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. Talking about death. I mean, time comes, then whatever you're going to do is going to have been done. I often say that life's kind of like a dairy farm. Cows have to be milked every day no matter what happens. But understand one thing. While the cows have to be milked every day, they don't care who milks them. If a person dies who owns the dairy farm, somebody needs to milk them that day, but it won't be him. So we need to stop and think sometimes about, what we do with our life. We kind of look at sins of omission, whatever it is we're omitting to do. I'm not even going to try to give you a list. You can think about it in your family relationship with your husband and your wife, your children, in the church, and your responsibility to it. Whatever you're talking about, you put it anywhere you want to. But you just need to ask the question of yourself and be honest and say, how well am I doing? Not so much in, don't tell me that I'm doing good because I'm not a drunk and I'm not a fornicator. That's not what I'm asking. How am I doing? Pretty easy to just ignore things that we leave undone. We need to be careful to understand how important they are. How many things do we not do that we should do? I would be terrified to take note in a day's time and have a little notebook, and every time something came up I should do and I don't do it, to write down and say I didn't do that. I think it's kind of a terrifying proposition. Let's take note of those things and correct the problem. Be careful that we don't just ignore it and think, well, that's just... I think one of the things that we kind of say that teenagers have this problem, but really all people have this problem. Teenagers sometimes argue with their parents, say, well, everybody's doing that. Well, That's not even true, but it's an excuse that's offered. In other words, my daddy used to say to me when I used to say that, and he would say to me, well, if everybody else hitting their head and self in the head with a hammer, would you do it too? Because they're doing it? Well, that's kind of a thing to think about. But we need to get it kind of realize that, yeah, everybody is doing it, probably. I mean, I can't imagine anybody's going to come to me and say, I've done everything I should do the day I should do it, the second I should do it, and I've never neglected anything. I'm not sure I ever met a person who won't say that. Except for Jesus, and I didn't meet him. Have not yet, hope to one day. But let's stop and think. If you're not a Christian, you know, that principle does apply. Today is the day of salvation. I understand that. But if you are a Christian, it still applies. Today is the day of salvation. Salvation is an ongoing proposition. It's not something that you know, like you go to the store and they punch your card, and then when you get 10 punches, you get something. That's not the way it is. Life's not like that. Life's something that every day is a new card. And when we stand before God in judgment, we'll be judged for the last day as well as the first. And something we need to stop and consider. Think about it together. We stand as we sing.